Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I'm Victoria from Keep It Holistic, where I talk about healthy living, motherhood, and more. And today I'm going to be talking about creating a birth plan. I'm actually in the process of creating a birth plan right now because in a couple days I'm having my 36-week appointment. And if you've ever had a home birth before, you'll know that at the 36-week appointment, that's when the midwives come to your house and you kind of scope out your living room and stuff, your bedroom, and just make sure your house is set up for home birth, and you go over your birth plan. And then also you might go over what to do if you have to get transferred to the hospital for some reason. So it's important to have a birth plan, especially if you are having or you're planning a low intervention, unmedicated hospital birth. Then yeah, you definitely want to have some kind of birth plan. Doctors don't always look at it, so it's important to make sure that your birth team is educated and they know about your birth plan so that they can be there to advocate for you, because it's harder to advocate for yourself in labor. And even it's good to have a birth plan or an idea of your birth preferences. Even if you're having a out of hospital birth, you might not have to have as detailed of a plan, but it's still a good idea to go over it with them and to have an idea of what you want to do in case you have to be transferred. So in this video, I'm just going to be going over some of the more main options. I'm not going to go into detail, and you really don't want to have an overly detailed birth plan. You want to kind of stick to the main points. And so one of the main things, especially if you're having a hospital birth, is to have freedom of movement and to birth in the position of your choice. And if you are having an epidural, this probably won't be possible because you have to lay on your back to have the epidural. You can't walk. But if you are not having medication, then you'll be able to get up and move around. But the problem with laying down in labor, and especially when you're giving birth, is it causes the pelvic opening to be smaller. And then if you were squatting or you're on your hands and knees or something, you're in a different position, it's going to be easier to give birth. You're going to be able to push and stuff more easily. So along with freedom of movement and birthing in the position of your choice, two other things that kind of go along with that is, of course, whether or not you want an epidural. So make sure you decide that ahead of time. You have a good idea. Sometimes when you get there, they'll be kind of pushy. If you're giving birth in the hospital, it'll be kind of pushy about you getting the epidural. Okay, now it's time to get your epidural. And you're like, no, I don't want the epidural. And then the other thing is you want to decide whether or not you want to have the continuous monitoring or the intravenous monitoring. And the difference is the continuous monitoring is when they have the little belt on over your belly and they're monitoring the baby's heart rate and stuff like that and your contractions. They're doing that continuously, so that typically requires you to lay down in bed, and that will make it a lot more difficult to give birth. Where if you have intravenous monitoring, they have you with that belt on every hour or something like that, or every once in a while just to check where the baby's at, that is going to be more conducive to unmedicated and natural birth. Another thing that is routine, especially in hospitals, but midwives do these as well, they're called cervical exams. They go by a couple different names. I'm going to call them cervical exams. Sometimes they're called cervical checks, pelvic exams, pelvic checks, I guess you could say. So cervical exams, what they are is when the doctor or midwife inserts 2 fingers into your vagina and they're checking to see your dilation, your effacement, and they're going to try to see where the baby's head is at. So they're checking the station, how far descended the baby's head is. And doctors and midwives will use this to kind of judge how far you're in labor and how fast you're progressing. And the problem is that this is not always an accurate measurement of where you're at in labor, because dilation, people don't dilate like machines. We're humans. So some people dilate really slowly at first and then suddenly go really fast at the end. That's pretty common. And then some people, they might dilate fast and then they'll sit at 6 centimeters for a long time, several hours, and then all of a sudden they're pushing, So dilation is not always accurate. And also it can increase the risk of getting infection, because every time they're putting their hands up there, they're introducing bacteria and stuff. Also, I want to mention before I move on to membrane sweeps, that sometimes cervical exams can be uncomfortable for people who have experienced a sexual assault, anything of that nature. It can be a little bit disturbing for some people. And so if that is you, you can always request not to have them done or to have a reduced amount of them done. And so this kind of leads into my next thing, is membrane sweeps. And sometimes these are done without consent. They'll do them when you're getting your cervical check, your cervical exam. This has happened to me, like when I went to the hospital, I had my very first ever cervical exam in labor, and they went ahead and did a membrane sweep without asking me, and it really like bothered me at the time. And so you gotta make sure that you request, you know, ahead of time, you get consent. They should be getting your consent, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can be helpful because they might help to kind of speed things along, especially if you're on the like verge of going into labor. Having a membrane sweep might help to kind of kickstart things. But for other people, like especially if you are nowhere near being in labor, it can cause you to have what's called like prodromal labor, or like a false labor. And I've experienced this as well, and what it feels like is you will have contractions, and they'll be coming like every 6 minutes, 7 minutes or something, and you're like, oh, I think labor's starting, and then it kind of peters out and doesn't go anywhere. And you can have these for like weeks. You feel like you're constantly going into labor for like days or weeks. Another really common thing that happens, especially in a hospital birth, but it can happen in a out of hospital birth too, is doctors often like to break the amniotic sac or the bag of waters either at the beginning of labor, before labor, or during labor. It's important to know the risks of this because it's so routine that they'll just, you know, be like, okay, let's go ahead and break your water. And you're like, wait, you know. So there is an increased risk of infection when you do this. It can make your contractions really intense and harder to deal with. It can not lead to anything, like you could break your water and then you have like maybe some contractions, but they don't go anywhere. It can increase your risk of getting a C-section or other interventions. And once your bag of water has broken, then you're going to be put on the clock. So they want you usually to deliver within 24 or 48 hours, because after that, the increased risk of infection is a lot higher. And at that point, they'll probably want to do a C-section. So if you're wanting to avoid a C-section, I would avoid having your bag of water broken. And then also the bag of water is kind of important for dilation, because that little bag of water above the baby's head helps to, as the baby's pushing down, it helps to dilate the cervix. So I would really recommend keeping the bag of water intact. If you are giving birth in the hospital, it's important to know whether or not you can eat or drink during labor. Other than like popsicles or ice chips, they typically, if you're having a hospital birth, won't let you eat or drink in labor. If you are giving birth outside of the hospital with a midwife, a lot of times they'll let you eat and drink. Another thing that's important to think about before you go into labor when you're creating your birth plan is whether or not you want to have an IV or a HAP block. And so what a HAP block is, if you're wondering, because you probably know what an IV is, but a HAP block is like the little needle and connector that they use to help hook up the IV. So if you have a HAP block, that means you have like the needle there and ready waiting, and then they can just insert the tube in there and give you your fluids or medication or whatever you need. Some people might like this because then you don't have to, you know, worry about having that done when you're further along labor and more in pain. It's already ready to go. But the downside of having this is that they have really easy access to your vein. So it's really easy for them to be like, okay, we're gonna give you Pitocin now. And you're like, wait, no. And they're just, you know, it's just ready and waiting, ready for that intervention that you don't want. I've had issues with it in the past. When I had my hospital birth, I had a HAP block and they left it in for like 24 hours because they wanted to be able to give me fluids after the birth as well in case I needed them. And I ended up having really, really bad bruising. So I would not recommend the HAP block. I would just recommend waiting and seeing if you need an IV. Another thing to think about, you might not have to put this on your birth plan, but it's something you might want to discuss with your birth team, is whether or not you want dim lighting. Do you want music playing? You know, you can pick your favorite music, something to pump you up, or maybe something more relaxing. Do you want like an essential oil diffuser going? That can be kind of nice. I had that at one birth, and it was really cool. And then also, do you want your birth team to, you know, speak quietly while you're in labor? You know, do you want people touching you? That's something to think about. And you might not know some of this until you're in labor, and then you just have to tell people, but you know, it's something to think about ahead of time. Now I'm going to move into the post-delivery part of your birth plan. And so probably the first thing that happens once the baby is born is they'll put the baby on your chest. Even if you're giving birth in the hospital, this is kind of routine. So you probably won't need to put this on the birth plan, but do you want to have, you know, time alone with the baby? Do you want to delay exams so that you can bond with the baby and breastfeed? Do you want people to like leave the room, leave you alone so that you can have a special bonding time with you, your partner, and the baby? This is kind of things to think about. Another thing is, do you want the cord to be clamped right away or delayed cord clamping? There's a lot of evidence to suggest that delayed cord clamping can be really beneficial for the baby. It allows the baby to get more blood, and that can give the baby a little more iron, because as the baby is, older, once the baby gets a few months old, they're not going to be getting as much iron. It's harder to get iron from breast milk. So having that little bit of extra blood, letting the cord pulsate until it stops pulsating, it'll turn white. You gotta also be aware of, sometimes in hospitals, they call delayed cord clamping like waiting just 30 seconds or a minute. Usually it takes several minutes for the cord to stop pulsating and to turn white. So you wanna make sure that you clarify that as well. Something also to think about when you're giving birth and right after birth is to think about your partner's role. And so do you want your partner, especially if you're giving birth outside of the hospital, you might have the opportunity to let your partner catch the baby, or do you want to catch the baby? And then also you want to think about, do you want your partner to cut the cord? They'll let you do this in hospitals as well. So think about that. And then also think about if you want to save cord blood or you want to save the placenta during your birth. Especially if you're giving birth in the hospital, they typically will take like the umbilical cord and the placenta and just throw it out as medical waste. So you want to make sure, especially I would try to do this ahead of time, like make sure that they know that you want to save your placenta. If you are planning to like encapsulate it or freeze it or something, just make sure that they know ahead of time. I've done a whole video on placenta encapsulation, so you can check that out if you're interested more in the benefits of that. This next one is pretty important. You want to know this definitely ahead of time, and I don't really have time to really go in depth in this video, but it's important to know what newborn interventions you want at birth. So soon after you give birth, they'll want to do they'll want to do the hepatitis B or the vitamin K jabs, or they'll want to do the antibiotic eye ointment. You want to make sure that you know like the risks or benefits and what you want to do ahead of time. People like to avoid these things like because of the adjuvants and additives in those jabs, and then the eye ointment can be not so good for gut health. So just do your own research and decide on that before you have your baby. Also, if you're having a boy or if you don't know the gender, then you want to decide ahead of time if you are going to do circumcision or not. And again, that's way too much for me to go into in this video. Make sure you do your own research. One last thing to think about, especially if you don't want your baby to receive some of those newborn interventions, is to decide if you want your husband or partner to stay with the baby at all times, or if you want the baby to stay in the room with you at all times, even during the exams. The reason for that is that sometimes they can take the baby out of the room and they'll do the exams, and then sometimes while they're doing those exams, they'll like go ahead and give your baby the eye ointment, and you didn't want them to do that, but because it's so routine, they don't think about that. They don't think about like checking your birth plan, and they'll just go ahead and do things without your consent. So it may be important to consider that, especially if you don't want those newborn interventions. So another thing that is routinely done, especially in hospitals, is to wipe the vernix off the skin. That's the white substance, and that is beneficial for their skin. They'll go ahead and right when you deliver the baby and start wiping that stuff all off. If you don't want that to happen, make sure you notate that, and also make sure that in your birth plan you notate that you don't want to give the baby a bath. So some of these things may not be applicable if you are planning an out of hospital birth, because of course you're going to be able to eat and drink during labor, you're going to be able to move around. That's kind of standard with out of hospital birth, but there may be other things you might want to think about. So if you're planning like a home birth, where's the home birth going to take place in your home? Like, you're going to do it in your living room, you're going to do it in your bedroom. Do you want to have a water birth or not? Is there space in your home for a tub, an inflatable tub? You need to order the tub ahead of time. Other things like who's going to catch the baby, because when you have a home birth, then you are more likely to be allowed to catch your own baby than if you're in the hospital. Who's going to cut the cord? Things that are a little bit different with home birth than there are, or even out of hospital birth, that are different than in the hospital. And I just thought of a few little things that my midwife did in my last birth that are not usually included in standard birth plans. Do you want anybody to pray over you while you're in labor? Do you want a prayer to be said right after you give birth? So think about that. And then another option, especially if you're giving birth outside of the hospital, is you might have the option of having an herbal bath right after birth, and this can help with healing. It's good because you can lay there in the bath and bond with your baby. So these are little things to think about, but they can be kind of nice. So these are things to think about whether or not you're giving birth in the hospital, in an independent birth center, or at home. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment down below. And please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys again soon. Be well, guys.